In terms of Canada's discussions on these, as you know, Minister LeBlanc had a meeting with his counterpart, Ambassador Greer, one of his counterparts, Ambassador Greer, last week, made progress on a number of these issues. We expect to make more progress when they meet next week at the G7.
Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc was talking earlier last week about negotiations with the U.S. That's the Prime Minister just from yesterday. It comes on the heels of the President saying he's not looking to renew the CUSMA deal. So where do negotiations stand now? What is Washington trying to signal to Canada? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Emilie Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir in Montreal. And Jason Markusoff is a producer and writer for CBC News in Calgary. He joins us from Edmonton. I'll have to pop out and say hello to you, Jason. Good to see all of you. I'm going to start with you, Tonda, and I want to get to the bridge, but I want to start first with the rhetoric of the president saying he's not sure he wants to renew CUSMA. And then all the signals from our government that seem to suggest there is some progress being made, even though formal talks haven't really started yet. What do you take from that?
I mean, I think two things can be true at once. I think the significant thing about what Donald Trump said last week was when he said it, the timing he's saying it in. 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks ahead of the July 1st deadline, when all three countries should basically declare they're committed to a renewal, or if they're kicking this thing into annual reviews and only going to extend instead of 16 years to 10 years out, or who knows what's going to happen. Look, he's been expressing skepticism about the deal from the get-go from last year. We've heard him say, I'm a tariff man. We've heard him say, I don't know if I'm going to renew it. I might terminate it. All of those things are true, but it's the timing. And so when the Canadian government pushes back and says, well, we are having discussions behind the scenes which are making progress on, now it seems, some 10 items that the U.S. has really at the top of their priority list to allow talks really to engage. I think some of that is true. They're not the kind of formal sit-down negotiations that Mexico is having on a much longer list of irritants, it seems. But at least there are talks, and I'm encouraged. Dominic LeBlanc has good political antenna. Janice Charette is a details person. Mm-hmm. And that tag team talking directly to the trading negotiators for Trump seem to suggest that there is movement. Things are happening. So I guess we have to trust it because we don't really know what's going on.
No, we don't. And Emilie, I mean, negotiations, I guess, have to stay quiet. Otherwise, it could upend things. But it does seem as though I don't know if there's concessions being made, but progress being made to even get to the table for review. It's like negotiations before negotiations.
Yeah, it seems there's a couple of elements that I think we need to take together. First of all, the refusal to open up the bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge. The shenanigans around the negotiations, will they or not negotiate, and how much they want to deal or not. And just the general sense that's coming up with more and more data to back it up as well, that there's vested interest in the White House in what's happening in Alberta and encouraging the separatist movement there. All of it together suggests that there is a vested interest coming from Washington to destabilize Canada. And I think it's not just, we all want to make a deal, let's make a deal, let's try to negotiate. I think if we are clear-headed about the fact that there seems to be just a will to destabilize Canadian economy, then the chaos starts to make sense. Then the having to jump into hoops just to get to the negotiating table the way that Mexico doesn't have to starts to make sense. Just maybe we're going to open the bridge, maybe not, and here's why, and here's the concessions you still have to make, and it's starting to make sense. And all the ways in which it's like this dangling carrot, right, that keeps moving forward as we are moving forward. It means that this strategy, as long as we're not all clear-headed about it, it's going to work because it forces the government to make concessions, to jump through hoops all day, every day on different issues that have nothing necessarily to do with CUSMA. Just 2 weeks ago, it was the issue of of taxing the platforms for cultural production, and so it's been a series of issues in which people have been making concessions in Ottawa, and all of it just basically advances American interests, and we need to be very, very careful about not just assuming that everybody's negotiating in good faith is trying to get to something productive for Canada.
Jason, do you agree with that? I mean, sure, I'm sure part of it is chaos theory, right? Just like make everything a little bit, upend everything to try and destabilize us and the negotiation. But what do you make, I guess, of how the Canadian government is responding to that, as Emilie says?
I mean, the Canadian government has tried to be the most patient it can be after every other major country, set a tariff deal at much higher tariffs than they'd ever accept. Canada never did. That was as Trudeau was coming in and as Carney was coming in, that's been the major strategy, and that seems to have worked. I know that in a lot of in most regions of the country, people do not feel it this way, but it does hold true that Canada is among the least tariffed countries right now, that we are feeling it less. Of course, it is still very, very acute. To Emilie's point about Alberta separatism, in a subtle, interesting way we don't talk a lot about, the U.S. government did something tremendous to boost the separatist sentiment in America, in Alberta, while the anti-American sentiment is so high and focused on uniting Canada here. It's that because the United States did not tariff oil, the major export, we do not have that sense of anti-Americanism in the same way in Alberta.
Wow.
And because of that, we can focus our energies and our anxieties on hating this city I'm in right now, Ottawa, hating the rest of Canada. So there's that, in that way, they've contributed to that destabilizing there.
Yeah, I haven't thought of it that way, but that's interesting. I want to go back to the bridge if I can, Tonda, because when the Prime Minister was asked about it yesterday, he again talked about technical issues. I'm not sure what the issues are other than money. It seems like that's probably what it is, given that at this stage anyway, because Canada paid for it, the U.S. isn't going to get anything back, and because, as other networks have reported, of this family ties of the other bridge to the Trump family. What do you think is going on here, and is the Canadian government right to just say, okay, we'll keep talking to you before we open it?
I mean, I don't think they have a choice. The fact is the traffic across the bridge has to land on the U.S. side and go through U.S. customs.
Yeah.
A number of weeks ago, I was looking at, sort of where the talks were at, and at that point, they were also saying, we're just working out a few things, and we expect to have things, all the on the Canadian side, the border agency had its people in place. They'd gone through all the tests, and things looked like it was going to get underway again. But look, the Maddie Maroon family that owns the other bridge, the competition, is a MAGA supporter, and it's very hard for us to outside untangle what's really going on. I think, it's pretty clear that Mark Carney doesn't want to talk about it publicly. He said last night, I believe, it's just not, he's been asked repeatedly, what are those technical issues? It's not productive to talk about them. Look, if this was just a matter of an off-ramp or how much staffing the Customs and Border Patrol on the American side were prepared to put in, or, overtime bills or something like that, or, maybe the steel just needs another engineering check, we'd hear about it. But no, it's, I think, a bigger piece of a much bigger puzzle that has to do with that's the largest crossing between Canada and the United States, across which goes, billions of dollars in trade. Yeah. So they really do, both sides need the opening and need the bridge and need the traffic to flow. But it's such a linchpin in the trade talks. I don't think we can, no one can assume that Canadians are stupid. We do get it's a bigger context.
We're definitely not stupid. 30 seconds to you, Emilie and Jason, then I got to go just on that issue.
Yeah, no, we're not. We're definitely not stupid. I think the end game there is always the same. I think it's been a year and a half. We're waiting in Canada for Americans to protest enough against the way the American government is treating us, and realizing that it's actually harming themselves. That's basically the message that every Canadian negotiator that's been traveling to the U.S. has been saying. So when it comes to the bridge directly, it's that as well. So I think it was at least good political theater to just say we're going to be opening the bridge and having to force the White House to be the one saying no. And then the question is how much interest it's going to wake on south of the border and how much pressure there's going to be for the people who are being harmed by the bridge staying closed, and how much pressure they can put on their government.
Jason, last word to you.
You know, I mean, this is a government in the U.S. that sees mutual benefit as weakness, that doesn't like win-wins. They want win-lose. It was striking that Peter Hoekstra, after retweeting the 51st state 2 weeks ago, the Trump's comment, he said he did put, use some Carney's words, saying a strong Canada is good for America. It's good that he says it this week. Will he say it again next week? Who knows?
That is the Prime Minister of Canada in County Mayo, Ireland, where his paternal grandparents are from, where they immigrated from back in 1921, I believe, to come to Canada, taking a lot of questions about what he's been doing over the past number of days and setting the stage for where he's going next, which is the G7 hosted by France, where he expects, as he said, that it will be geopolitics that will be the focus of conversations, notably whether or not a deal will be had by the United States and Iran. The president was just posting about that on social media again now, but also taking some questions about artificial intelligence, because that too is also on the agenda for the G7. Let's bring back our Sunday Scrum to talk a little bit more about what we heard there from the Prime Minister. Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Emilie, Nicolas, columnist for Le Devoir, and Jason Markusoff, a producer and writer for CBC News. He's in Ottawa today. I don't have a lot of time because the Prime Minister took most of it, but that's okay. But I do. We were supposed to talk about the online harms bill, but because the Prime Minister just talked about AI, I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what we would expect to hear coming out of this G7 meeting. It doesn't sound like, from what he's saying, there will be some universal statement, but he does sound as though he wants to see some sort of progress on it, realizing that there are some challenges because of what has happened with Anthropic and the United States government saying there was potential security risks there. Tonda, what stood out to you in terms of what he said on that front?
I mean, I think AI was among a couple of other topics, defense and trade, where he talked about, working with like-minded countries and towards common goals. And I think at this G7, what he's signaling is that despite the fact that he agrees with perhaps Macron and others in terms of regulating AI and the big tech companies, that there's a tension there, right? And he's flagging very quickly right now that, he dubbed the sort of, even the approach on what you should assume is a common goal, protecting children online or child safety online, he flagged, our approaches were dedicated to that versus a laissez-faire approach. And that signals that, look, they view the U.S. Approach to how to regulate AI, chatbots, social media, as something that somewhat steps back from the responsibilities that the other G7 partners are, I think, embracing. Right. But in all of this, I think, the tension between the other G7 partners and some of the guest countries and the U.S. are going to become very apparent in the next few days.
Yeah, I mean, AI is just one area where there'll be that tension point, Emilie, but certainly the Prime Minister wants to talk Ukraine. The President of Ukraine will be there. A lot of focus will be on, I would imagine, whether or not this deal with Iran actually happens, because there is also some concern, as expressed by the President just now, about what's happening with Lebanon. The back and forth there between Israel and Lebanon, and getting that to stop at the same time. But Emilie, when the Prime Minister talked about AI and he said, you can't. This is what happens if you have an over-reliance on one model. And in this case, nobody's done anything wrong yet. What did you take from that in terms of what his concerns are around things moving too quickly down that road?
Yeah, there's two things. There's over-reliance on one model, but there's also over-reliance on one country. I'd say that one of the biggest transformations that we've seen over the past 20 years is how, the GAFAM domination, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, and all the other guys, Microsoft, just all happen to be based in the US, and how those companies have taken over our lives, and how there is now a collision basically between essentially what we see as private sector, economic, large corporations, and the White House and U.S. national interests in a way that is unprecedented, and especially since Donald Trump has come to the White House, there's not even a theater trying to shy away from the fact that those CEOs are being aligned with the White House, and we've seen the whole spectacle with Elon Musk. Now, when it comes to AI, it's the same thing where you have this technology that is about to, or has started to disrupt the ways our societies are organized, the way work is organized. And so much of it is controlled by just this one country. And if you look at history, that's never good news, that there's one country controlling a technology or a resource that is affecting all of the world. And so when it comes to AI and ethics and regulation, there's two things. There's the coalition between Washington, the collision of interest between Washington and the national interests and the private companies. But there's also, and that's what I think the G6 basically is trying to look into. But there's also the ethical issues that people here in Montreal with AI ethics researchers have been calling about for years. And that's not necessarily something that Mark Carney or Macron are interested into that much. They want the development, but they want to benefit from the development as well. Well, there are also a lot of ethical researchers who've been saying, this is happening too fast, not just because it's DC control, but because there are ethical issues there that are not being solved by Mark Carney inclusively.
Jason, I have about a minute left for you.
So it was really interesting to see how he. I mean, the talk about let's not have one option. I mean, that was the big he didn't mean it. He didn't say it in his initial comments, but as he spoke about it contemporaneously in his speech, he seemed like that he realized that was one of his big kind of overarching comments, that we don't need one reliable thing. When Mark Carney talks about wanting this new world order, what he seems to be really talking about is that we need to go back to go club among the people who believe in the rules-based order, the nations that believe in the rules-based order, which is over, which U.S. is increasingly not a part of, that China and often India are not a part of, and there are these other seemingly fickle, unreliable nations or groups that operate like nation states, which are the big tech companies, which Canada has learned can burn you, can try to pressure you on various things. So as Canada tries to group together with those reliable countries and expand trade, expand collaboration with them, become stronger with them as opposed to being overly aligned and becoming a sort of client state with U.S., that will be able to work more with those ad hoc and have more leverage to make useful deals and useful arrangements that work with or work despite of the hegemons.
You did perfectly with timing. Thank you all for all your smart thoughts and for sticking around for the PM. Appreciate it. Tonda MacCharles, Emilie, Nicolas, Jason, Markusoff. Thanks, everybody.